My name is Elara Merritt. I am 45 years old. For 27 years, I served this country as an officer in the United States Cyber Defense Command. I have led operations most people will never hear about. I have worn the weight of secrets that kept others safe while silently losing pieces of myself along the way. But the worst betrayal I ever faced did not come from foreign adversaries. It came from the people who were supposed to love me the most, my own family. And it happened in a courtroom. I still remember the way they looked at me that morning. My parents, my younger brother Lucas, his wife Eva. Faces I had known all my life, suddenly unfamiliar, cold, rehearsed. They called me a failure. They mocked me for abandoning the family while I was busy serving in uniform. They said I was mentally unstable, unfit to make decisions, unworthy of what they believed I no longer deserved. They demanded everything. The house I grew up in, the assets I had quietly accumulated through decades of sacrifice, even custody of my own name, my place in our family's history. I stood there in full military uniform, listening to my own mother speak about me as if I were a stranger. My father nodding solemnly, as if this courtroom drama was somehow breaking his heart. Lucas and Eva sitting side by side, hands clasped like heroes in their own story. And for the longest time, I said nothing. I let them talk. I let the world believe I was what they painted me to be: cold, selfish, broken. Because you see, I wasn't interested in winning the crowd. I was interested in something much bigger: the truth. And when my moment came, I reached for the one thing I had carried with me all along: a single sheet of paper. I approached the judge, slow, deliberate, every step echoing in the tense silence of that courtroom. I placed the paper down. I looked him in the eye, and I said calmly, "Sir, with your permission, I believe this should be read before any further ruling is made." He adjusted his glasses. He read the first line, and then the second, and I saw it, the shift. His face changed. His eyes widened. He set the paper down and lifted his gaze toward the bailiff. "Close the doors," he said, his voice steady but sharp. "No one moves." My parents went pale. Lucas froze, confusion flashing across his face. Eva whispered something I couldn't hear, her hands trembling. And then they came, federal agents, uniformed officers, moving fast and silent. The courtroom erupted, gasps, footsteps, the sound of metal as handcuffs clicked into place. I did not move. I did not speak. I simply stood watching the walls of their carefully crafted lies collapse in real time. The truth is, I could have fought them sooner. I could have screamed, accused, made noise. But that's not who I am. I am a soldier. I know how to wait. I know how to gather. I know how to strike once and with precision. What they never understood is that while they were busy playing petty games over inheritance and family status, I was unraveling something much darker, much deeper than any of them realized. They thought they were robbing me of money, of property, of dignity. They didn't know they were exposing themselves to a reckoning that would leave none of them untouched. And as the judge ordered the arrests, as my family sat there stunned and broken, I felt nothing. No triumph, no rage, just a quiet certainty. Some battles are not fought on distant shores. Some battles happen in quiet rooms under fluorescent lights, with the weight of years pressing down on your chest. This was my battlefield, and I had already won. The paper I placed on the judge's desk wasn't just evidence. It was the culmination of months of silent endurance, quiet investigation, and a refusal to let betrayal rewrite my story. They mocked me for failing. They demanded everything. All it took was one sheet of paper to change everything. And the moment those courtroom doors closed, their fate, like their lies, was sealed. The first sign came quietly, the way most betrayals do. It was a Tuesday morning. I remember because I was sitting at the old kitchen table, sipping burnt coffee from a chipped mug, when the email arrived. Subject: confirmation of veteran relief enrollment. Sender: National Military Assistance Fund. I frowned. I hadn't applied for any relief program. I didn't need to. My military benefits were intact. My finances, though modest, were stable. At first I thought it was a scam. One of those phishing attempts that prey on service members. But then I saw it. The email had my full name, my military ID, my home address, this address. It even referenced deployment dates that weren't public record. Something twisted in my chest. I clicked through carefully. There it was, an application already approved for financial hardship assistance. The funds had been dispersed to an account I didn't recognize. I closed the laptop. My hands were steady, but I could feel the cold knot tightening in my stomach. Later that day, I made a quiet call to an old friend, someone in federal finance who owed me a favor. It took less than an hour for the pieces to start falling into place. This house had been refinanced 3 months earlier. The ownership had quietly shifted into the name of a shell company, the same company Lucas had been bragging about at Thanksgiving 2 years prior. The one he said was just a side hustle. Except this side hustle now held the deed to my parents' home, the home I had helped pay off using combat pay from my 3rd tour. I sat alone in the guest room that night, the only space left that still felt like mine, and reviewed the documents one by one. The signatures, the timelines, the way my name vanished from official records like smoke. And then I noticed something else, small, almost insignificant. A photocopy of the latest transfer had a tiny blue smudge in the corner, just a trace, but familiar. Printer ink. Lucas used to have that same stain on his fingertips when he was a teenager, working part-time at a print shop. He hated how the ink clung no matter how much he scrubbed. The next morning, I found him in the living room, casually scrolling through his phone, Eva draped across his shoulder like some perfect suburban painting. I held up the printed deed transfer. My voice was calm. "What is this, Lucas?" He barely glanced at it. "It's a business thing. Dad and Mom signed off. It's not a big deal." My mother's eyes darted toward my father. He cleared his throat but said nothing. I pressed. "Why is my name removed?" "Why wasn't I told?" Lucas shrugged. "You're never here. You don't need the house. We were just consolidating assets." I laughed softly, the sound brittle in my throat. "Consolidating, that's what you call it." Eva chimed in, then her voice syrupy sweet. "Elara, you've been through so much. I think maybe you're overreacting. This is just practical, for the family." The family, as if I wasn't part of that definition anymore. I looked at my mother. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, the diamond in her wedding ring, catching the morning light. She wouldn't meet my eyes. I tried one last time. "Did you know? Did you sign this?" Her voice was barely above a whisper. Lucas explained everything. "It's for the best." Something inside me cracked. Not loudly, not visibly, just quietly, like a hairline fracture spreading through glass. I nodded. Once. Then I left the room. No one followed me. In the hallway, I passed the mirror and caught sight of myself. The uniform, the medals, the silent witness to who I had been and who I no longer was. For the rest of that day, no one spoke of it again. We ate dinner like nothing had happened. Conversations about weather, grocery lists, television shows. But everything had changed. I lay awake that night, the faint scent of lavender from my mother's laundry soap clinging to the sheets, and I realized something cold and undeniable. This wasn't just about a house. This wasn't about money. This was a choice. They had chosen. And in that choice, they had already told me exactly where I stood. Outside. The lawsuit came 2 weeks later. I remember the weight of the envelope when I first held it, heavier than it should have been, as if the paper inside already carried the weight of betrayal. My name printed cleanly on the front, the Merritt family crest in the corner. It looked official, polished, cold. When I opened it, I read the words over and over, but for a long time, they made no sense. Plaintiff Lucas Merritt. Defendants Elara Merritt. Claim misappropriation of family trust funds. Undue influence. Emotional distress. Emotional. I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands didn't shake. They never do. But something inside me, something fragile, collapsed. I had faced IEDs, rogue drones, cyber attacks designed to cripple entire systems. But this was different. I wasn't being attacked by strangers. I was being erased by the people who were supposed to be mine. By noon, the story had hit the local news. By evening, it had gone regional. Decorated Army colonel sued by family over alleged financial misconduct. Sources say veteran took advantage of elderly parents. The images they used were carefully selected. My stern military ID photo. A blurred shot of me in uniform with arms crossed. The kind of pictures that made me look cold, unreachable, dangerous. I didn't watch the news, but the calls started coming anyway. Friends I hadn't spoken to in years suddenly felt the need to check in, their voices strained, careful, walking that invisible line between curiosity and judgment. Some didn't call at all. By the end of the week, the silence was louder than the headlines. I remember sitting in the corner booth of the cafe downtown, one I used to visit with my mother when I was home on leave. The waitress recognized me. I could tell by the way her eyes flicked between me and the TV above the counter where the news anchor's polished voice recounted my supposed crimes. I left without ordering. I kept to myself. I said nothing publicly. In the army, you learn that sometimes the worst thing you can do is overreact. You wait. You gather. You watch. But inside, the betrayal sat like a stone in my chest. Heavy, unmoving. I received an email from my commanding officer offering temporary administrative leave to handle personal matters. The wording was polite, but the meaning was clear. I was becoming a liability. I took the leave. I didn't argue. I needed the time anyway. The days blurred. I spent hours sifting through legal documents I never thought I'd have to read. Asset lists, family trust agreements, financial records going back decades. Lucas claimed that I had manipulated our parents into signing over control of the family's assets during one of my leaves from deployment. He accused me of using psychological pressure, leveraging my military authority to intimidate them. The language was designed to sting, to twist my years of service into something ugly. I could have called him, could have gone to the house, could have demanded an explanation, but I didn't. Instead, I sat in the quiet. I let the world swirl around me, the news, the whispers, the sideways glances. And I thought about the look on my mother's face when I first stepped through the door after Syria. How even then there had been something distant in her eyes. I thought about the casual way Lucas had brushed off my questions about the deed. The practiced softness in Eva's voice when she spoke to me, too sweet to be real. I thought about all the times I had come home, believing that no matter how hard the world outside became this house, these people would be my constant. And I realized that home didn't exist anymore. I wasn't fighting to keep a family. I was fighting to expose a truth. The difference mattered. And so I stayed silent. I didn't rush to clear my name. I didn't feed the rumors. Because sometimes the loudest thing you can say is nothing at all. I don't know the exact moment when suspicion became certainty. Maybe it was the way Lucas started avoiding direct eye contact when I asked simple questions. Or the way Eva always smiled too perfectly, her words just a little too polished, her tone dipped in sweetness but leaving a bitter aftertaste. Or maybe it was me. Maybe I had spent too long living in a world where patterns meant survival, where reading between the lines could save lives. Maybe I was just imagining things. That was the part that scared me the most. Because once you've seen enough betrayal on the battlefield sometimes, your mind starts creating shadows where none exist. But this didn't feel like shadows. It felt real. It started small. A discrepancy in a bank statement. A company name, Valen Group Holdings, that kept appearing in documents linked to the family trust. At first I thought nothing of it. But then I looked closer. Valen Group didn't exist 5 years ago. No public records, no real office. Just a name attached to shell corporations and real estate transactions. Lucas was listed as the chief financial officer. I sat in the dim glow of my laptop, night after night, cross-referencing data with quiet precision because this was what I was trained to do. The same methods I once used to trace terrorist financing in war zones, I now used to follow my own brother's paper trail. And what I found chilled me. Large sums of money flowing through accounts linked to veteran assistance programs. Loan applications filed under names I recognized soldiers I had served with. Some of them deceased. Some very much alive but unaware. At first I thought it was identity theft. But then I saw Eva's name. Her so-called counseling service, the one she'd casually mentioned at family dinners as her new passion project, was nothing more than a front. A list of patients revealed familiar names, mostly veterans, men and women I vaguely remembered from local ceremonies or VA hospitals. And suddenly I could see it. The scheme, the way it worked. They weren't just taking money, they were stealing identities. Using the vulnerability of veterans people like me to create fake profiles, apply for grants, launder money through Lucas's company, and then bury the evidence under layers of fabricated mental health services. It was elegant in a sick way. And the worst part? My parents' signatures were on everything. At first I thought it had to be a mistake. Maybe they didn't understand what they were signing. Maybe they'd been manipulated, maybe, but the dates told a different story. The transactions were too regular, the signatures too neat, the consistency too perfect to be accidental. I sat back in my chair, breathing shallow, the room closing in. For the first time, doubt crept in. Not just doubt about them, but about me. About my own mind. Was I reading too much into this? Had I become so paranoid from years of chasing enemies that I was inventing threats where none existed? I heard my mother's voice in my head, gentle warn, the way she used to sound when I was a child, Elara. Not everything is a battle. Not everyone is out to get you. I closed my eyes, pressing my fingers to my temples. I wanted to believe that, desperately. But then I remembered the look on Lucas's face when I confronted him about the house. The emptiness, the calculation. And I remembered the ink stains. They had been sloppy once, careless, because they thought I wouldn't look, because they thought I couldn't see, but I saw now. And the more I uncovered, the more the pieces clicked into place. This wasn't a family dispute. This wasn't about money or inheritance or bruised pride. This was organized, methodical, criminal. And somewhere along the line, the people who once loved me had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. The problem was, I couldn't prove it, not yet. And somewhere deep down, that seed of doubt still twisted, whispering that maybe I had finally broken. Maybe I was chasing ghosts and shadows of my own making. But I kept digging, because even if I was wrong, I had to know. And if I was right, then this wasn't just my family's shame. It was something far, far worse. There's a kind of silence that doesn't come from noise fading, but from people pulling away. At first, it was subtle. Calls that used to come every week suddenly didn't. Texts sat unanswered. Invitations stopped arriving. Friends I'd known for years, some from my earliest days in uniform, others from local community events, began to vanish from my life one by one. Not in any dramatic way. Just gone. Fading like fog. Even my old commanding officer, the one who once told me I was the steel backbone of his unit, began to sound different on the phone. Careful, measured. I could hear the quiet shift in his voice when he said things like, "Maybe you need time to reset, Elara. Maybe you've been under too much pressure for too long." I told him I was fine. I wasn't. And the more I stayed silent, the more the distance grew. The lawsuit had made me toxic. No one wanted to be near the wreckage. Not when the headlines made me look like a manipulative soldier exploiting her own family for financial gain. I stopped going to the cafe. Stopped going to the gym. Even the grocery store became something I planned with surgical precision, in and out before the stairs could sink too deep. It was easier to be invisible. But the loneliness, it carved me out from the inside. I had faced isolation before in foreign deserts, in undisclosed bunkers, but this was different. This was personal. This was the kind of isolation that whispered you were never really loved to begin with. And still, I stayed quiet, because underneath the despair, underneath the bone-deep exhaustion, something else was building. I call it the hum. It's that faint vibration in your mind when instinct tells you there's more. Something you haven't seen yet. A thread buried deep, waiting to be pulled. And so I began to pull. I started small. Old contacts. Favors not yet expired. Quiet conversations in encrypted channels. No paper trails. I re-examined every document tied to Lucas's company. Every grant Eva's therapy practice had applied for. I combed through public records, social media, financial disclosures. Most nights I worked in the dark, the only light coming from my laptop screen. The house around me asleep. The silence thick enough to suffocate. I felt the despair rising more than once. There were nights I caught myself whispering out loud, half to myself, half to ghosts. What if they're right? What if this really is just me unraveling? But the data didn't lie. Patterns emerged. Connections that hadn't been obvious before. Transfers timed too perfectly with my deployments. Fake clients linked by IP addresses. Duplicate signatures. Digital fingerprints I had spent years of my military life learning how to find. And then, a break. One flagged transaction. A payment routed through a foreign-owned bank I recognized from prior classified work. It wasn't just domestic fraud. It was bigger. It was international. For the first time in weeks, something shifted in my chest. Not relief, Not yet, but the tiniest flicker of oxygen in a room that had been sealed shut. I could feel my pulse settle, my breath even out. The despair pulled back just slightly like a tide. I wasn't imagining this. I wasn't broken. There was something here, something dangerous, something deliberate, and I was the only one willing to see it. That flicker of hope wasn't much, but it was enough. I started to sleep again, restless, shallow, but sleep nonetheless. I started to eat real meals instead of living on stale coffee and adrenaline. I started to remember who I was. They had taken my reputation, my sense of belonging, my name in some circles. But they hadn't taken my mind, not yet. And that was enough to keep going. I knew the fight ahead would be ugly. That whatever I was uncovering wasn't just a family betrayal, it was something far larger, far more dangerous. But for the first time in a long time, I felt steady. I felt ready. And in the quiet, I made myself a promise I would not let this end in silence. There's something mechanical about investigation. It's not like the movies, no sudden light bulb moments, no dramatic music swelling as you crack the case. It's slow, meticulous, tedious. It's hours of looking at lines of numbers until your eyes blur, of tracing names through databases that lead nowhere, of staring at screens until doubt becomes your constant companion. But the funny thing about patterns is, they always leave traces. I started with what I knew: Lucas's company, Valen Group Holdings. I already had the surface-level information: shell companies, asset shuffling, questionable bank accounts. But I knew that wasn't enough. Not for what I felt in my bones. Not for what I knew was still hiding. I pulled up my secure laptop. Even though I was on administrative leave, some doors never fully close when you've spent your life in military intelligence. I wasn't breaking laws. I was bending them. At first, the transactions looked ordinary: business expenses, equipment rentals, consulting fees. But I wasn't looking for what was there, I was looking for what shouldn't have been. I set filters, looked for transfers just under mandatory reporting thresholds, flagged unusual currency exchanges, searched for offshore entities with registered addresses in tax havens. Hours blurred into days. And then I saw it: a payment routed through a foreign-owned bank flagged years ago for laundering cyber ransom payouts. A name appeared indirect, buried 3 layers deep, but there: Pavan Risk Management. I knew that name from briefings, from classified reports, from the kind of whispered conversations you only have behind closed doors. Pavan wasn't just some offshore consultancy. They were linked to industrial espionage, specifically targeting defense contractors, cyber infrastructure, and yes, military supply chains. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. This wasn't just about money. This was about information. I dove deeper. Another transaction, another name, and then another. Eva's therapy practice, the one I had always dismissed as harmless, was receiving payments from small nonprofit organizations tied to veterans' mental health. On the surface, it looked like she was consulting on PTSD recovery programs. But the amounts were too high. The timing was too perfect. And then the final piece clicked. Many of those veterans were people I had served with, or people connected to bases I had been deployed from. And some of those names weren't even real. They were fabricated identities used to apply for aid programs, grants, and even my heart stopped when I saw it: military clearance renewals. Clearance renewals. I felt my breath catch. The scheme wasn't just about stealing money. They were extracting personal data. Data that in the right hands or the wrong ones could open doors to restricted systems. Systems that held national security secrets. I sat back, the weight of what I was seeing pressing down on me like lead. Lucas wasn't smart enough to have designed this. Neither was Eva. This was bigger, smarter. Someone else was pulling the strings. They were just the willing hands. I rubbed my eyes, exhausted. But I kept going. I cross-checked timestamps, traced IP addresses. Every thread I pulled revealed more rot. Offshore accounts tied back to contractors flagged by the Department of Defense. Temporary businesses dissolved overnight after receiving government funds. Anomalous login attempts into restricted military networks. From devices traced to civilian locations. I felt sick. It was a latticework of greed and espionage so carefully constructed that had I not lived in this house, had I not known these faces, I never would have seen it. And they had used my name, my service record, my deployments, my reputation. Because who better to exploit than the soldier too distracted by battlefields abroad to see the war at home? For a moment my vision blurred, my hands trembled, but then I forced myself to breathe. This was the part they never show in stories, the moment when fear and rage collide so tightly you can't separate them. The moment when you understand that you've been used not just as a pawn, but as a shield. That everything you sacrificed was not only unappreciated, it was weaponized against you. I could have walked away. I could have turned it over to someone else, let someone higher up handle it, but I knew I wouldn't. I couldn't. I closed the laptop. My mind spun, but my pulse steadied. The fog of isolation, the bitterness of betrayal, it all crystallized into one singular thought: I was done being silent. They thought they could hide behind family ties, behind the illusion of normalcy, behind the legal walls they'd built to keep me boxed in. They were wrong. I didn't have all the answers yet, but I had enough to know that I was standing on the edge of something far more dangerous than a family dispute. And this time, I wasn't backing down. The next crack in the illusion came faster than I expected. I had barely begun to process the magnitude of what I'd uncovered when something else shifted. It started with a name buried in a data packet, so small, so easy to miss. The name was in the metadata of one of Eva's supposed therapy reports. An encrypted communication tagged to an IP address outside the US. The name Arvos International. To most people meaningless. To me it rang alarms deep in my bones. Arvos was not just some corporate shell. They were flagged years ago by Joint Cyber Command for covert intelligence operations, specifically extraction of sensitive defense technologies, destabilization of allied security networks, targeted infiltration through civilian channels, and somehow Eva was connected to them. I remember sitting at my desk staring at the name, my fingertips cold despite the heat of the room. It was like falling through ice. Everything suddenly too quiet, too still. And then the phone rang. It was an unlisted number. I almost didn't answer. Almost. The voice on the other end was distorted, mechanical. Male or female, I couldn't tell. "Stop," it said. "This isn't your war. Walk away." I stayed silent. The voice clicked off. The line went dead. I lowered the phone slowly, my heart pounding harder than any battlefield had ever made it pound. This wasn't just about fraud anymore. It was about surveillance, about control, about people who were watching me far more closely than I had realized. The next night, another call. Different number, same message. "Leave it alone." I didn't sleep. Every sound in the house became amplified. The creak of floorboards, the whisper of the wind against the windows. I felt like prey inside my own skin. My breathing shallow. My hands restless. It reminded me of my first combat deployment. The days before the first real ambush. The way your body knows before your mind catches up that something is wrong. The way your senses sharpen while your soul shrinks. And the dreams started. I don't even know if I'd call them dreams. More like fragmented memories. Of childhood. Of the first time Lucas pushed me into the lake and I almost drowned. Of my father pulling me out, his face blank instead of frightened. Of my mother standing on the dock, not moving, not calling my name. Of the night I took my oath to serve, how Lucas hadn't even come to the ceremony. How Eva had made a joke about me playing soldier that I laughed off because I thought it meant nothing. I woke up sweating, disoriented. The calls kept coming, 3 in one day. Then silence for 48 hours. Then another at 3:17 a.m., waking me from restless sleep. This time the voice was different, softer, almost familiar. "I'm warning you. They're watching. You can't stop this." I sat up, heart slamming against my ribs. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice hoarse, but the line had already gone cold. I checked the house, every window, every door. I don't know what I thought I'd find. And then I saw it, a small black car parked half a block away. Engine off, lights dead. But I could feel the weight of whoever sat inside it. I didn't call the police. I knew better. This wasn't petty harassment. This was deliberate. This was organized. I took my Glock from the safe, loaded it without thinking. The feel of it in my hands steadied me. Hours later, when dawn finally crept over the horizon, the car was gone. But something had shifted inside me. The fear? It wasn't crushing anymore. It was sharpening, clarifying. The worst kind of threat isn't the one that screams. It's the one that whispers. that seeps in until you can't tell what's real and what's imagined. I sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cold cup of coffee, and I made a decision. No more waiting. No more hoping the truth would reveal itself. I would find it. I would expose it. Whatever they thought they could do to silence me. They had underestimated the wrong woman. I spent the next 72 hours locked to my screens. Every connection Eva had made. Every overseas call Lucas had routed. Every false identity. Every forged document. Every alias. And then I found the message. Buried inside an encrypted attachment on Eva's patient files was a single line of text in broken code, package secured. Clearance updates pending, awaiting extraction, package, clearance, extraction. I wasn't just dealing with thieves, I was dealing with operatives. I exhaled slowly, my breath shaking, and the memories returned clearer this time. The look on Lucas's face when I shipped out for Afghanistan. The way Eva's smile never quite reached her eyes. And beneath it all, the voice of my drill sergeant on the first day of training, always assume the enemy is closer than you think. I finally understood. They weren't just close. They were already inside the walls. I knew it had to end face to face. All the data, all the encrypted messages, all the hidden transactions, I had them. But none of it mattered until I stood in front of the people who had set this in motion and looked them in the eyes. I wasn't prepared for how much it would still hurt. I asked them to meet me at the house I was born in, the house I thought would always be home. When I arrived, they were already there. My mother sitting stiffly on the edge of the living room sofa, my father by the window, arms crossed, jaw tight. Lucas wasn't there, Eva wasn't either. Just the two people who had raised me, who had once held me through nightmares, who had once written me letters in desert wars signed love. Always Mom and Dad. The room was heavy, thick with history. I set the folder down on the coffee table without a word. They didn't reach for it. They didn't ask. I spoke first. My voice was even, deliberate. I know everything I said. The financial fraud, the identity theft, the connection to Arvos International, the clearance data being funneled offshore. My mother's face twitched, just barely. My father's eyes stayed flat. I continued. I know Eva's practice is a front. I know Lucas's company is a laundering machine. I know your signatures are on documents that make this more than just negligence. I paused. Tell me, I asked softly. Did you ever stop even once? Did you ever think about who I was to you before you signed your names to this? For a moment, just a moment, my mother's eyes filled with something almost like regret, but it vanished before I could name it. My father cleared his throat. Elara, I think you've misunderstood a great deal. This isn't what you think it is. I laughed. Quiet. Bitter. I'm not here for lies, I said. I'm here for one answer. Why? They looked at each other. A silent exchange. Then my mother spoke. You've always been distant, she began, her voice brittle. Even as a child. Always somewhere else. Even before the army, before the deployments. She swallowed hard. Lucas, he's here, he's family, he's present. He cares about the day-to-day, about us. I stared at her, disbelieving. Present, he's using you, using your names, using everything this family ever stood for. And you're calling that love? My voice cracked. I hated how much it cracked. My father stepped in. His words slow, deliberate. Family is complicated, he said. And sometimes, Elara, you have to choose the child who stays. It landed like a slap. I stood very still. The air in my lungs tasted sharp, metallic. I thought of the night Lucas left me stranded on the side of the road when I was 15. He took the car, drove off after a fight. I walked 5 miles home in the rain. I never told anyone. When he came back hours later, my mother called it just siblings being siblings. I thought of the day I shipped out for my first deployment, how no one came to the send-off ceremony except an old college friend. I thought of the birthday cards that stopped arriving after my 3rd tour. The Christmas dinners I missed that no one mentioned. And I realized something terrifying. I had been losing them for years. This wasn't sudden, it wasn't about money, it wasn't even about betrayal. It was about belonging. And I had stopped belonging a long time ago. I stepped back, breath steady, but thin. Family, I said quietly, isn't blood. It isn't history. It isn't obligation. I looked them both in the eye. Family is choice, I said. And I wasn't the one who stopped choosing. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. The moment stretched thin, fragile, final. I exhaled. I will bring this to light, I told them. I don't need your permission. I don't need your blessing. I lifted the folder again, tucked it under my arm. I'll see you in court. I turned toward the door, heart pounding in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to keep walking, to not look back. But I stopped, just once, just long enough to say the words I didn't even know I'd been carrying. Family, I whispered, is what you fight for, not what you sell. And then I left. The door clicked softly behind me. Outside, the sky stretched endless and gray. The wind tugged at the edges of my coat. I felt the tears start. Hot, silent, unrelenting. But I kept walking, because whatever they thought they could take from me, they would never take my will to fight. Not again. I didn't sleep much after that night. There was no going back. No undoing what I'd said. No unseeing the truth I had uncovered. The court date was set. 2 weeks. 2 weeks to prepare for the battle of my life. Not against enemies on foreign soil, but against my own blood. And I knew I couldn't do it alone. That's when I called in the only kind of help I trusted. Off the books, off the record, and unflinchingly loyal. We called ourselves Shadowline. Not officially, of course. It wasn't a sanctioned unit. It wasn't even supposed to exist. Just a loose network of former intelligence operatives, cyber defense specialists, and human assets, whose lives, like mine, had been built in the shadows. I reached out to Anna first, old friend, former NSA. She answered on the first ring. Been waiting for this call, she said, her voice low. What do you need? Within 48 hours, she connected me to 2 others. Miles, a cybersecurity prodigy, with fingers in every digital vault from DC to Dubai. And Cole, ex-psych operations, a man who could read a human mind like an open map. We met in an abandoned cabin 3 hours outside the city. Neutral ground. No cell signals, no prying eyes. I laid it all out: the fraud, the laundering, the ties to Arvos International, the coded communications, the forged identities. They didn't flinch. Anna shook her head when I finished. This isn't small, she murmured. You know that, right? This is multi-layered. The kind of operation that doesn't just ruin lives, it gets people disappeared. I know, I said softly. That's why I can't stop. Miles pulled out his tablet. Within minutes, he was already cross-referencing data points, flagging anomalies. Cole scribbled patterns onto a legal pad, muttering to himself in that eerie, detached way he always had. For a moment, I let myself breathe. I wasn't alone anymore. And yet, the weight in my chest didn't ease. That night, back in the sterile quiet of my apartment, I sat by the window watching the streetlights flicker and drifted into memory. I was 9 years old again, sitting on the front porch watching my parents argue through the thin glass of the living room window. Lucas was inside, as always, the center of everything. I remembered the exact words my mother had said, even though I hadn't understood them then. Some children are easier to love. I had carried those words into every battlefield, every late-night mission, every moment when fear and doubt crept in. And somehow, even now, they came back to haunt me. I shook the memory off, forced myself back to the present. I spent the next week preparing. We built profiles, we traced offshore accounts. We secured counterintelligence evidence that could stand in both civilian court and, if necessary, federal inquiry. But with every breakthrough came more danger. Another anonymous message appeared this time, not a call, but an envelope slid under my door in the dead of night. No return address. Inside, a single sentence typed in block letters. Stand down, or we take what's left. I burned it without blinking, because fear was no longer an option. By day 8, we had the full blueprint. A digital map of the financial web Lucas and Ava had built. Names, accounts, passcodes. We even traced physical meeting points between Ava and foreign intermediaries, one of them caught on surveillance leaving the embassy of a hostile state. It was more than enough. But the fear, quiet, corrosive, never fully left. I dreamed of Lucas's face, of my father's voice telling me I had never really belonged, of standing alone on the playground in 2nd grade while the other children huddled together, shutting me out. Even as an adult, even with a team, the feeling remained. Alone. But here's the thing about soldiers, about survivors. We move forward anyway. The night before the hearing, Anna handed me a small flash drive. "This is it," she said. "Everything you need to bury them." I nodded. "Are you ready for what comes after?" Cole asked, his tone unreadable. I looked him dead in the eye. "I've been ready my whole life." And I meant it. Because when family turns into the enemy, the war stops being about winning. It becomes about surviving. And tomorrow I intended to survive. The day of the hearing arrived with the cold clarity of a battlefield dawn. I dressed in my full uniform, not for theatrics, not for sympathy, but because it was the truth of who I was, who I had always been, long before they tried to rewrite my story. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Pale walls, fluorescent lights, too ordinary for what was about to happen. Lucas sat across from me, flanked by Eva and their legal team. He didn't meet my eyes. Eva gave me a brittle smile, the same one she wore when she'd first joined the family years before any of this had begun. My parents sat in the second row. My mother clutched a tissue she barely used. My father's hands were folded motionless, his face carefully blank. I took my seat without a word. Their lawyer spoke first. A woman sharp as broken glass, her voice smooth, practiced. She painted me as cold, manipulative. A woman so consumed by ambition that I had stolen from my own blood. She spoke of sacrifice as if it were a vice, spoke of service as if it were abandonment. I sat still through every word. When they dragged out my deployments, when they framed my absence as proof that I was less of a daughter, less of a sister, I didn't flinch. When they suggested that the stress of war had damaged me beyond recognition, that I was unstable, perhaps even dangerous, I didn't blink. I had been called worse. By better, I thought of Afghanistan. The endless desert wind. The way the sun could bleach bone until it looked like polished ivory. The way we learned over and over that sometimes silence was survival. And so I stayed silent. Even when Eva took the stand, her voice trembling, her hands folded neatly in her lap, speaking of how she'd tried to reach me, how she'd watched me change, how she'd feared for the family. I said nothing. It was masterful in a way. The lies, the half-truths, the weaponized sentimentality. The judge listened, expressionless, and I waited. I waited through the legal jargon, through the carefully constructed character assassination, through the false tears and the rehearsed sympathy. Until finally it was my turn. I rose. I didn't look at Lucas, or Eva, or my parents. I looked only at the judge. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady. "I won't waste the court's time with a defense of my character. That's not why I'm here." I reached into my case, pulled out a single sheet of paper. "I have one document to submit," I continued quietly. "I believe it will clarify the nature of this situation." I crossed the floor, every step deliberate. Placed the paper gently on the bench. The courtroom was silent, too silent. The judge adjusted his glasses, began to read. I watched the shift happen, slow at first, then faster. His eyes narrowed, his lips pressed into a thin line. He read to the end, then read it again. And then, without looking up, he spoke 4 words that changed everything. "No one leaves. Close the doors." The bailiff blinked, startled, then moved. The room erupted. Not in sound, no shouting, no chaos, but in breathless confusion. Lucas stiffened. Eva's eyes darted. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father's face finally broke the blankness, giving way to something I couldn't name, fear perhaps, or recognition. The doors closed. Locks clicked into place. And then they arrived. Federal agents, moving fast, controlled, purposeful. One headed straight for Lucas, another for Eva. A third stepped toward the bench, whispered something to the judge. He nodded sharply. Eva's voice cracked first. What is this? This is insane." Lucas rose from his chair. "We need to sit down," the agent ordered. "Now." I stood still. I didn't move. My heart pounded, but my breath stayed level. I had seen raids before. I had ordered them. But standing on this side of it, watching the slow dismantling of a lie built over years, it felt surreal, and in a way, inevitable. The judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Merritt, Ms. Merritt, you are being detained under suspicion of financial fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit cyber espionage against the United States government." Eva crumpled first, tears spilling. Lucas's face twisted, not into guilt, but into pure rage. And still, my parents said nothing. I met my mother's eyes once, just once, but there was nothing left there to reach for. The agents moved efficiently, restraints clicked, papers gathered. The courtroom so full of polished lies moments before now lay stripped bare. I turned toward the judge. With the court's permission, I said softly, "I'd like to request immediate protective custody for any veterans whose identities were compromised, and an investigation into the laundering channels used." He nodded without hesitation. And just like that, it was done. No more silence, no more shadows, no more pretending. The paper had been enough. The truth had always been enough. The sound of the handcuffs was quieter than I expected. It wasn't the clatter you see in movies, no shouting, no slamming. Just the soft click of metal on bone. The calm, methodical movements of federal agents who had done this too many times before. Lucas didn't resist. He barely moved. Eva sobbed loud, unrestrained, her carefully painted mask shattered completely. She kept shaking her head, whispering over and over, "I didn't mean this wasn't supposed to happen." But Lucas, he was silent. His eyes found mine once, briefly. And for the first time in months, maybe years, I didn't see smugness. I didn't see cold calculation. I saw something else entirely. I saw defeat. I saw the boy I used to know, the one who built wooden forts in the backyard with me, who dared me to climb 2 high trees and held out his hand when I slipped. And for the briefest, cruelest moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The agents read the charges with mechanical precision: conspiracy to commit fraud, identity theft, cyber espionage, violation of national security protocols. Lucas didn't blink. My parents sat frozen, pale and brittle, as if one wrong movement would shatter them into dust. My mother's lips moved silently, mouthing words I couldn't hear. My father just stared. His hands still folded like this was some distant nightmare that hadn't yet touched him. I should have felt vindicated. But the truth is, I felt nothing, or at least nothing clean. I kept hearing my own voice in my head, the words I'd thrown at them. Family is choice. I'm not the one who stopped choosing. But part of me, some buried, bitter part, remembered something else too. I remembered the pressure we both grew up under, the expectations, the endless comparisons. Lucas was the golden child because he had to be. Because every time he faltered, my father's disappointment came down like a hammer. Because every time he failed, my mother's soft sighs cut deeper than any words. And me, I was the escape artist, the one who left. I remembered the night before my first deployment. Lucas drunk in the driveway, slurring something about how I got out while he was stuck with their dreams. I remembered the way he looked at me, not with hatred, with envy. And that's the thing no one ever tells you about betrayal. It's rarely born from pure malice. More often, it's born from pain. The agents led them both past me. Eva wouldn't meet my eyes. Lucas did. And just before they pushed him through the door, he said it soft, almost inaudible. "They made me. I could have let it pass. Could have written it off as another lie. But I didn't. Because the truth, the real truth, is rarely black and white." I sat down. My knees trembled in a way the rest of me refused to show. My hands stayed folded. My breath stayed steady. But inside, something was splintering. The courtroom emptied slowly. My parents stayed seated, motionless. I don't know how long I sat there before I stood. I approached them carefully, like approaching wild animals. My mother's eyes were distant. My father's face was blank. For the first time, they looked old to me. Not cruel, not monstrous, just small, fragile. I spoke quietly. "You should go home." My mother blinked. A tear slipped free. She didn't wipe it away, and then she whispered something I'll never forget. We just wanted him to be someone." The words hit harder than any accusation. Because in that moment I understood. They had wanted Lucas to succeed because they had failed themselves. Because he was the vessel for all their dreams, the dreams they'd pinned too tightly, too selfishly. And when I left, when I became something they couldn't control, he was all they had left to shape. He broke. They broke him. I exhaled. Steady, controlled. But deep down, the weight of that realization carved a hollow in my chest. I didn't know how to fill. I left them there. I didn't look back. Later, alone in my apartment, I sat by the window watching the lights blur into the night, and I thought of every mistake I had made. Every time I chose distance over closeness. Every time I buried myself in work and missions and walls built too high for anyone to climb. I thought about how Lucas wasn't the only one shaped by expectation. I thought about how maybe in some terrible way we were both broken by the same hands. And I knew I would carry that weight long after the case was closed. Because justice isn't healing, and winning isn't the same as peace. But still, I had chosen. And that choice was mine. The world exploded before I even made it home. By the time I stepped through my front door, my phone was already vibrating nonstop calls, texts, news alerts. The headlines were everywhere. Decorated Army Colonel exposes family espionage ring. Hero or betrayer Elara Merritt's family scandal rocks military community. Family or country, the unthinkable choice of a soldier. My face was plastered across every screen. Photos pulled from deployment archives, old interviews, even grainy shots from the courtroom steps. The story wasn't just national, it was viral. And with it came the flood. Some people called me a hero. Messages poured in veterans, military wives, strangers who said I gave them hope, who said I proved that truth still mattered. But others painted me as the villain. Accused me of destroying my family for attention, for greed, for some twisted need to be right at any cost. Family is sacred, one commentator spat on a late-night talk show. What kind of person destroys their own blood like this? I watched it all in silence. I didn't respond. I didn't correct the narratives. I didn't explain. Because if there's one thing the military taught me, it's that silence is a kind of strength. Not every battle needs a reply. Not every shot needs to be answered. I sat alone on my couch phone, face down, television on mute. The apartment felt too quiet, too still. And yet beneath the numbness, something pulsed. A low, steady rhythm I recognized from combat zones. The aftermath. The space where adrenaline fades, but the consequences linger. I thought of Lucas, of his face when the cuffs clicked shut, of the words he whispered. They made me. I thought of my mother's voice, small, broken. We just wanted him to be someone. I thought of the little girl I once was sitting on the porch in the dark, listening to the arguments inside, wondering why she always felt outside. The wave of public attention lifted me high, then pulled me low. One moment, strangers online called me a symbol of integrity. The next, anonymous messages accused me of betrayal, of cruelty, of being less than human. I could feel myself slipping between the cracks, rising, falling, rising again. And then I remembered something my old CO told me during my first deployment, when everything felt too big, too overwhelming to survive. Hold the line, he said. Even when the ground shifts. Even when the noise is deafening. Hold the line. So I did. I turned off the TV. I shut down the news feeds. I made tea. Simple, steady. And I reminded myself I didn't do this for applause. I didn't do it for punishment. I did it because it was right. Because silence isn't just the absence of noise. Sometimes silence is survival. The controversy ignited faster than I expected. The news broke within hours. Lucas and Eva in federal custody. Multiple charges pending, but my parents, untouched. The official statement was clinical. Due to advanced age and underlying health conditions, Mr. and Mrs. Merritt are not currently facing prosecution. But the public didn't care about the legal jargon. The backlash hit hard. Talk shows erupted. Commentators fumed. Social media split in two. Some said mercy was the right choice, that dragging frail elderly people through the courts would serve no justice, only cruelty. But others, many others, were furious. They signed those papers, one headline screamed. They watched this unfold, another insisted. Why do they walk free when others fall? The anger built tide after tide of outrage. Hashtags trended, petitions circulated. Even people who had supported me in the beginning now questioned everything. I became the face of the scandal, whether I wanted it or not. Every camera pointed at me. Every microphone stretched closer. What do you have to say about your parents, Colonel Merritt? Do you believe justice was served? Did you push for leniency? I said nothing. Not once. Not to any of them. The night after the news broke, I stood alone on my balcony phone, dark in my pocket, and I listened to the city breathe beneath me. I thought of my parents. sitting in the same living room where so much of this had begun. I imagined my mother's trembling hands, my father's glassy stare. I thought of the weight of their choices, the weight of mine, and I thought quietly bitterly how none of it felt like victory. I could still hear my mother's words, "We just wanted him to be someone." I could still see Lucas's face haunted hollow as they led him away. It would have been easy to speak, to issue a statement, to clarify that I had no hand in the prosecutor's decision, that this was never about revenge, that I hadn't sought their punishment, only the truth, but I didn't, because deep down I knew no words would matter. Not to the people who already hated me, not to the ones who wanted to crown me, and certainly not to the family I had already lost. So I held the line. I let the headlines burn. I let the world spin. And I remembered something an old intelligence officer once told me in a briefing room in Kabul. Words that had carried me through deserts, through battles, through years of invisible wars. Sometimes the loudest voice is the one that says nothing at all. I stayed silent, because silence is not surrender. Silence is survival. The first time I saved a life, I was 24 years old. It wasn't on the front lines. It wasn't in the chaos of combat. It was in a dusty medical tent, miles from anything that resembled civilization. A young corporal, barely more than a boy, bleeding out from shrapnel wounds. I remember the weight of his body as we lifted him. The way his eyes locked onto mine, terrified, pleading. I remember whispering over and over, "Hold on. Just hold on." And he did. That moment never left me, not through the years, not through the battles, not through the betrayals. And now, standing at the threshold of something new, I thought of him again. Because saving people doesn't always look the way you think it will. The Sentinel Foundation began with nothing but an idea, a whisper, a need. I funded it quietly at first. No press, no headlines, just a handful of trusted allies, people who knew what it meant to serve and to come home shattered. Our mission was simple: to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Veterans defrauded, manipulated, discarded by systems too broken to notice. We offered legal aid, cyber defense, identity protection, counseling. But more than that, we offered something I had once gone years without: someone who believed you were worth saving. Some days it felt small, insignificant, like bailing water from a sinking ship. But then I'd see the letters, the quiet thank yous, the way a single intervention could change the course of someone's life. And I kept going. I thought back to the nights I lay awake in desert silence, listening for the crack of gunfire, the rush of helicopters, the fear that never fully left. I thought of the faces, friends who made it home in body but not always in mind, names etched into marble walls, stories that ended too soon. And I promised myself whatever time I had left, I would spend it fighting for them, for the ones who served, for the ones who were forgotten, for the ones who, like me, had been broken but refused to stay that way. People started calling me things: advocate, survivor, hero. But I didn't need the names. All I needed was the work. Because the truth is, I wasn't just saving others, I was saving myself. One case at a time, one life at a time. One quiet victory in a world still full of shadows. The letter arrived on a quiet Thursday morning. No fanfare, no headlines. Just a simple white envelope with no return address slipped into the pile of bills and advertisements. I almost didn't open it. But something, call it instinct, made me pause. I sat at the kitchen table, sunlight filtering through the blinds, the city humming softly outside. I slit the envelope open and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Handwritten. Neat. Careful. It began simply. Dear Colonel Merritt, you don't know us, but because of you, our family is still whole. I read it once, then again. They told me their story, how a fake veterans charity had drained their savings, how they'd nearly lost everything, how no one listened until someone from the Sentinel Foundation stepped in, stopped the fraud, recovered their funds, and protected them from future harm. They wrote about fear, about shame, about the silent weight of being deceived and left behind. And then near the end they wrote something that caught in my throat. We thought we didn't matter, that no one would fight for us, but then you did. I sat very still. The letter trembled slightly in my hands, not from weakness, just something else. I thought of the first soldier I saved, the look in his eyes when we pulled him back from the edge. I thought of the weight of his life in my arms, the way time stretched and twisted in that moment. How everything else faded but the sheer determination not to let go. And I realized this was the same thing. Different battlefield, same fight. I felt something stir inside me, something unfamiliar, something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in longer than I could remember. A smile. Small, tentative, but real. I traced the words with my fingertips, the paper soft beneath my skin. I could almost hear their voices, see their faces, and for the first time in years longer, maybe I felt lightness. Not the absence of grief, not the erasure of what had happened, but the quiet truth that life could still offer small moments of grace. I folded the letter carefully, placed it in the drawer beside my medals. The city outside kept moving, the news kept spinning. The world remained loud and restless. But inside in that stillness, I held on to one truth. Saving people doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it comes with silence. Sometimes it comes with a single letter. And sometimes that's enough. I stood by the water's edge as the first light broke across the horizon. The ocean stretched endless in every direction, quiet, unhurried. The air was sharp with salt, the breeze cool against my skin. I closed my eyes and listened. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was peace. Not the absence of memory, not the erasure of pain, but the simple quiet stillness that comes when you've carried the weight, faced the storm, and somehow made it through. I thought of every step that led me here. I thought of Lucas, of the boy he once was, the man he became, and the choices he made. I thought of my parents, of the things they gave me and the things they took away. I thought of the battles I fought overseas, the ones I fought alone in the dark corners of my mind, the ones I fought here on home soil where no one clapped, no one saluted, and no one kept score. And I thought of the people who still carried their own unseen wars, strangers, survivors, the voices I'd met through the Sentinel Foundation, who reminded me every day why the fight mattered. There's something you learn in the military that no one talks about. Not every battle is loud. Some are fought in boardrooms, in courtrooms, in the quiet spaces between breaths where choices are made and lives are changed forever. Some battles you don't choose, but you fight them anyway. Not for revenge, not for recognition, but because sometimes the line between right and wrong isn't blurred at all, it's clear, and someone has to stand on the right side of it. I opened my eyes. The waves moved in steady rhythm. The wind whispered through the grass. And somewhere far behind me, the weight of the past no longer pressed quite so heavily on my shoulders. I let the silence stretch, let the air fill my lungs, because I'd learned something else too. Some battles are fought in silence, and sometimes that silence is the loudest victory. I stood there for a long time, just breathing, just being. And when I finally turned away, I carried that stillness with me, not as armor, but as grace. Before we say goodbye, we'd love to know. Where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Let us know in the comments. We read everyone with gratitude. And if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel, not just to hear more stories like this, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Wherever you are, we hope you carry this story with you. And remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly until you're ready to open your heart. Take care, and we'll see you in the next story.